I had spent 3 days on my feet cooking Christmas dinner for 22 people. And when I carried the last dish through that front door, my mother-in-law looked me dead in the eye, turned to the room full of guests, and said, "Isn't it wonderful what I've put together this year? And I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. I did not drop the dish. I did not correct her in that moment. I did not make a scene because I already knew exactly what I was going to do. And it was so much better than any argument in a hallway. Hey, welcome back. You found your way here again, and I'm glad you did. Because today's story is the kind that starts in a kitchen and ends with a woman finally deciding that being gracious has a limit, and she found hers at a Christmas table. My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm from Bristol, and I have been married to James for 11 years, which means I have also been managing his mother, Diane, for 11 years. And if you have a mother-in-law who treats your presence in her son's life like a minor administrative inconvenience, you already know the particular exhaustion I'm describing without me having to explain a single word of it. Diane is the kind of woman who wraps control and warmth so expertly that most people never notice the grip. She talks about family constantly, uses the word love like punctuation, and has a gift for making other people feel grateful for things she has quietly taken from them. James thinks she is simply passionate. His sister thinks she is simply traditional. I think she is simply someone who decided very early on that her son's wife was a supporting character in a story where Diane was always going to be the lead, and she has spent 11 years making sure everyone in that family believed it too. The Christmas thing had been building for years before it finally broke open. Every December, the whole family descended on Diane's house in the Cotswolds. 20-plus people, 3 generations, the full chaos of it. And for the first few years, I stayed in my lane, brought wine, helped clear plates, smiled at stories I'd heard 4 times before, and tried very hard to be the daughter-in-law she might eventually decide to like. That strategy did not work, because Diane didn't want to like me, she wanted to manage me. And there is a significant difference between those two things. Around year 4, I started cooking. Not because anyone asked, not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I genuinely love it, and because the food at Diane's Christmas had always been, to be completely honest, a bit sad. Overcooked turkey, packet stuffing, a pavlova from a supermarket that she presented like she'd assembled it by hand. Nobody said anything, because nobody wanted the conversation that came with saying anything. I offered one year to bring a dish. She said yes with the energy of someone granting a small favor. I brought a slow-roasted lamb shoulder that disappeared in 11 minutes. The following year, she asked me to bring 2 things. The year after that, 3. By year 7, I was driving up to the Cotswolds with the back of my car packed with containers, doing most of the actual cooking on Christmas Eve in her kitchen, while she sat at the island with a glass of wine telling me stories about James as a child. And I want to be clear that I didn't mind the cooking. I loved it. What I minded was the invisible line she had drawn between the labor and the credit, because Diane had quietly decided that food made in her house by hands in her kitchen was food she had provided. Full stop. And not once in 4 years of this arrangement did she stand up at that table and say Claire made this. Not once. The Christmas that finally finished me started the same way all the others did. I got there Christmas Eve afternoon with everything prepped and labeled, a full menu I'd been planning since October because that is genuinely how much I care about feeding people well. Beef Wellington as the centerpiece because James's grandfather was turning 80 and it was his favorite. Honey-glazed carrots, roasted potatoes with rosemary and garlic, a proper bread sauce made from scratch, 2 types of stuffing, a wild mushroom tart for the vegetarians, and a chocolate and salted caramel roulade for dessert because the supermarket pavlova era was behind us and I was not bringing it back. I spent Christmas Eve and Christmas morning in that kitchen. Diane floated in and out, refreshed her drink, rearranged a centerpiece I hadn't touched, and at one point suggested the carrots might need more butter, which they did not. James helped where he could. His sister set the table beautifully. And by 2 in the afternoon, the whole house smelled extraordinary, and 22 people were arriving at the door in good coats, carrying wine they'd panic bought on the way. Dinner was served at 4. The table looked genuinely lovely. The food came out perfectly timed because I had written a color-coded schedule and followed it like a professional, which I am, because I run a small catering business from home that has been growing quietly and steadily for 3 years, something Diane acknowledges the way you acknowledge weather, with a vague nod and no real interest. James carried the beef Wellington to the table because it was his grandfather's birthday, and that felt right. Everyone gasped a little because it was beautiful, golden and tight, and exactly what it was supposed to be. And then Diane stood up. She does this every year, the little toast before the meal, the moment where she surveys the table and welcomes everyone and reminds the room whose house this is. She raised her glass. She smiled around at all those faces she loves, and she said, "I just want to say how much it means to have everyone here. And I hope you enjoy everything I've put together for today. It's been quite the effort, but you're all worth it." 22 people raised their glasses. James squeezed my hand under the table, which told me he'd noticed but wasn't going to say anything, which told me something else entirely. His grandfather said, "Diane, it looks magnificent." His aunt said, "You've outdone yourself." A cousin I barely knew said, "This is unbelievable. You must have been cooking for days." And Diane laughed, that warm, modest laugh she keeps ready for moments like this, and said, "Well, you know me. I do love looking after my family. I cut a slice of the Wellington and put it on my plate and ate it, and it was genuinely perfect, and I allowed myself to feel that quietly while the room carried on around me. I said nothing for the rest of the meal. I topped up glasses. I helped clear between courses. I brought out the roulade and watched it get demolished in 10 minutes. And when Diane's sister said it was the best Christmas dessert she'd ever had, Diane said, "I found the most wonderful recipe." I smiled. I stored it. After dinner, I was in the kitchen with James's sister, Sophie, loading the dishwasher, and Sophie looked at me sideways and said very quietly, "She did it again, didn't she?" I said, "She did." Sophie said, "James should have said something at the table." I said, "Yes, he should have." Sophie said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I'm better than all right, actually." And I meant it, because I had made a decision somewhere between the bread sauce and the roulade. And the decision was this: I was not going to fight Diane in her own house at Christmas with her family watching. I was going to wait, and I was going to let her keep the credit for one more night. And then in January, I was going to stop catering Christmas entirely. And I was going to do it in a way that was so clean and so simple and so completely within my rights that she would have absolutely nothing to push back against. January 3rd, I sat down with James. Not an argument, a conversation, which I had rehearsed enough to keep calm, but not so much that it felt like a performance. I told him I loved cooking for his family, and I was proud of what I put together each year. And then I told him what his mother had said at the table, word for word. And I told him I knew he'd heard it, and I needed him to understand why it mattered. James is a good man who spent 30-something years being managed by a woman who is very skilled at making him feel like disagreement is disloyalty. He went quiet in the way people go quiet when they know you're right and are trying to find the path between agreement and what agreement will cost them. I didn't fill the silence for him. He said, "She doesn't mean it the way it sounds." I said, "James, she stood in front of your grandfather on his 80th birthday and took credit for a meal I spent 3 days making. I'm not asking you to pick a side. I'm telling you that I won't be catering Christmas next year." He looked surprised, genuinely, and I think that surprised me. He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I mean, I'll come. I'll bring wine. I'll be delighted to be there. But the cooking is done. If your mom wants to host 22 people for Christmas dinner, she's more than capable of organizing that." He said, "She's going to be upset." I said, "She'll manage." He didn't argue after that, which was honestly the most important thing that happened in that whole conversation. He called his mother the following week. I was not in the room for it, because it was his call to make, not mine. He told her I wouldn't be catering Christmas going forward, gave no detailed explanation, kept it simple, and she took the news the way Diane takes most things she doesn't like, with a very long pause, and then a pivot to how hard it would be to find something comparable. She called me 2 days later. Her voice had that particular softness she uses when she's actually annoyed and covering it with warmth. She said she hoped there was nothing wrong, hoped I hadn't taken anything the wrong way, that she'd always been so grateful for my contribution, that the family really did rely on me at Christmas. That word contribution. Not cooking, not work. Not the 3 days on my feet, or the beef Wellington, or the roulade. Contribution. Like I'd done a sponsored walk. I told her I appreciated that, and that I was sure the family would put something lovely together. And I kept my voice completely even and warm throughout the entire call, which I think was harder for her to process than anything else I could have said. Christmas this year arrived the way Christmas always does, slightly too fast and slightly too loud. We drove up to the Cotswolds. I brought 2 very good bottles of wine and a box of expensive chocolates, and I walked through that front door carrying nothing that required refrigeration. The house did not smell the way it usually smelled. There was a slightly anxious energy in the kitchen, a supermarket turkey that went in late, some confusion about the timings, and by 3:30 it was clear that dinner would be closer to 6 than 4. Nobody said anything rude. The family pulled together the way families do. Sophie quietly fixed the gravy. James's uncle carved the turkey. 2 cousins peeled emergency vegetables at speed. I set the table and opened the wine and kept everyone's glass full and told James's grandfather 3 times that he looked wonderful. Because he did. Dinner was fine. Truly, it was fine, which is exactly the word for food that has been assembled in a panic by people who didn't plan. The turkey was a touch dry. The roast potatoes were soft where they should have been crisp. There was no dessert beyond the chocolates I'd brought, which actually went down very well. Diane sat at the head of the table and smiled through all of it, with the fixed determination of a woman who would not be seen to struggle. And I respected that about her, even while knowing she'd built the situation herself. She did not make a toast before the meal. Midway through dinner, James's grandfather leaned over to me and said, "Claire, love, I don't suppose you might do your beef Wellington again next year." I smiled at him and said, "Let's see how the year goes." He patted my hand. Diane heard every word of it and said nothing. After dinner, I was back in the kitchen with Sophie, and Sophie looked at me with something between awe and guilt and said, "I had no idea how much you were doing." I said, "Neither did she, apparently." Sophie laughed, which broke something open in a good way. She said, "What would it take to get you back next year?" I said, "Honestly, just say my name at the table." Sophie said, "That's all?" I said, "That's everything. Here's my opinion, and I'm not softening it. Taking credit for someone else's work isn't a personality quirk, or a generational habit, or something that has to be tolerated because it's Christmas, and keeping the peace matters more than the truth. It is a choice, made deliberately, repeated consistently, and it tells you exactly how much that person values your effort versus how much they value being seen for it. Diane didn't make a mistake at that Christmas table. She made a decision. And the only thing I regret is that it took me 4 years to make mine. I'm not cruel. I'm not at war with her. I'm not trying to ruin Christmas for 22 people. But I am done being the engine behind a train that someone else gets to drive while I shovel the coal and wave from the back. Next Christmas is still months away. James and I have talked more honestly in the last 12 months than we managed in the 3 years before it, which might be the most unexpected outcome of the whole thing. Diane has been carefully, noticeably warmer to me since January. Whether that lasts past November, I genuinely don't know. What I do know is this. I have a catering business. I have a skill I worked hard to develop. And when I put 22 portions of beef Wellington on a table, the person who made it deserves to have her name said out loud in a room full of family at Christmas. That's not too much to ask. It's actually the very least that love looks like when it's real.